I'm Gary Jensen. I'm running for President of the United States. I was excluded from the debates tonight from New Hampshire, so I'm coming to you via tape, and that would be answering all the questions that the candidates answered tonight. And I'll try and do that very succinctly. And here we go.
I'm here with Mr. Marquez Serling. He is a retired professor from Plymouth State University, and he's got a question about jobs.
Yes. Mr. Gingrich said there are 14 million people unemployed. My question is this. The Democrats say that the Republicans don't have any plans to create jobs and jobs in the private sector, not in the government jobs. I'd like to know, what are those plans?
I would eliminate the federal corporate income tax, understanding that it's a double tax. We all own the corporations. When we get money distributed to us from the corporations, we pay tax on that money. I think that with all the federal stimulus money that has been spent recently, which I object to all of it, eliminating the corporate income tax would have gone a lot further. I believe that eliminating the corporate income tax would create tens of millions of jobs, and then add to that certainty in government policy. As governor of the state of New Mexico, I think businesses went to sleep at night knowing that they weren't going to have needless regulation or fees piled on to the businesses that they conducted. And as a result of that, like I say, there was certainty in New Mexico. As an example, right now, the coal industry, we're not building any new coal-fired plants because of the uncertainty over carbon emissions. Eliminate that uncertainty, and I think that you're looking at hundreds of thousands of jobs just in being able to build coal-fired electrical generation facilities.
Yes, thank you, John. I'm here with Sylvia Smith. She's from Littleton, and she is a freelance journalist who's written about the healthcare industry. She has a question about healthcare.
Yes, as a journalist who's written frequently about healthcare and medicine for both newspapers and for corporate publications, I'm very concerned about the overreach of the massive healthcare legislation that was passed last year. My question is, what would each candidate do? What 3 steps would they take to defund Obamacare and repeal it as soon as possible? Thank you.
I would do everything I could to repeal President Obama's health care plan. I think that very simply, we can't afford it. I think Republicans would gain a lot of credibility in this argument if Republicans would offer up a repeal of the prescription health care benefit that they passed when they controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency just a few short years ago. At that time, that was the largest, biggest entitlement ever passed in the history of this country. We couldn't afford it then. We can't afford it now. And on top of that, Republicans passed record spending levels. So I think both parties share in this, and if we would join hands, if you will, in the notion that both parties share in where we're at fiscally speaking, which is bankrupt, that we can in fact then tackle health care. A long-term solution to health care is a free market approach to health care. And by the way, health care in this country is about as far removed from free market as it possibly could be.
Hi, John. Thank you very much. I'd like you to meet Terry Poff tonight. Tell me I said that last name correctly, Terry. Granite State or born and bred?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being here. And what's your question for the candidates tonight?
Well, my question is that I am a New Hampshire native, and I've been an active Republican for years, from a town committee chairman, Republican chairman, Merrimack County, vice chairman, all the way up to a 2004 delegate for President Bush. My question is, how will you convince myself? I'm not a libertarian Republican. I'm not a Tea Party Republican. I'm just a mainstream Republican, and we need both the independents and mainstream Republicans to win in November. How can you convince me and assure me that you'll bring a balance and you won't be torn to one side or the other from any faction and within the party? You have to have a balanced approach to governing to solve our serious problems.
So I think that I have demonstrated that I represent a balance. New Mexico is a state that's 2-to-1 Democrat. As governor of New Mexico, I vetoed 750 bills. I had thousands of line item vetoes as governor of New Mexico. I had as many vetoes as governor of New Mexico as arguably the other 49 governors in the country combined. Only 2 of those vetoes were overturned, so the whole notion of smaller government is better government, the whole notion of empowering individuals to make their own decisions because individuals are best suited to make individual decisions, is something that I did the entire time I was in office. I think what demonstrates that I represented across the board, that it wasn't extreme in any way whatsoever, is the fact that I got reelected in a state that was 2-to-1 Democrat, arguably being the fiscally most conservative governor in the country. I just think it speaks volumes to the fact that people appreciate good stewardship of tax dollars.
Thanks very much, John, and welcome to the Hancock Inn. I'm standing here with Mike Patinsky. He is a small business owner from Harrisville, New Hampshire. And Mike, what question do you have tonight?
Well, for the candidates, I'd like to know how they plan on returning manufacturing jobs to the United States.
Eliminating the corporate income tax, in my opinion, would reestablish this country as the only country to grow, nurture, and develop business. Our manufacturing jobs have gone overseas. I believe in free markets. I think you either believe in free market or you don't. You believe in the notion that we all benefit from the lower costs of goods and services, and that results from a free market. In a free market economy, with the United States not having a corporate income tax, where else would you conduct business but the United States?
The possibility exists that New Hampshire could soon become the 23rd state to pass right-to-work legislation. Unions don't like it because they feel that making membership voluntary would weaken organized labor. You know, you've seen the protests in your home state of Minnesota. My question is, where do you fall on right-to-work, and would you support a federal right-to-work law?
I am first and foremost a states' rights individual. So individual states need to determine whether or not they want to support federal right-to-work legislation. I support the notion of right to work and worked hard to see that happen in New Mexico. It didn't while I was governor of New Mexico, but that didn't take away from my support. The only basic problem that I have with unions is the union gives me 2 workers. One is the worst worker that I've ever seen. The other is the best worker that I've ever had. I can't reward the best. I can't get rid of the worst. Right to work, I think, is a decision that states should make. I think based on right to work legislation in states across the country, those states that have passed right to work have shown much greater economic prosperity as a result of that legislation.
Leno or Conan?
Leno.
Elvis or Johnny Cash?
Elvis.
The federal government now assists many industries, green jobs, the auto industry, research and development, all get subsidies. Given the current state of the economy, what standards do you have, if any, for government assistance to private enterprise?
When it comes to government assistance, government picks winners and losers. Government picks winners and losers when it comes to business, banking, foreign governments. I think what people in this country are fed up with, and I include myself in this, is this whole notion that the government is unfair, that it's a rigged game. What we need to do when it comes to legislation, and this is what I would have done as governor of New Mexico, is I vetoed a whole lot of legislation that I will call corporatist kinds of legislation. I'll call legislation that really stacked the cards against the notion of a level playing field. What the government needs to provide is a level playing field where you can go from having nothing in this country to having everything if you're willing to work hard and innovate. But government gets in the way. Government adds to this notion of unfairness that does exist. It does exist, and it exists politically. Let's put an end to it. As governor of New Mexico, I would like to think I put an end to it by vetoing the kinds of legislation that would have given unfair advantage to so many businesses, groups, and individuals that were well connected politically, as opposed to a level playing field for everybody.
Yeah, thank you, John. I wanted to ask About the auto industry, General Motors and Chrysler have rebounded since the Obama administration bailed them out. Bankruptcy is no longer a threat. Would you say the bailout program was a success?
Well, the bailout program was not a success in any way. Look, we have a mechanism for restructuring in this country, and it's bankruptcy. If Chrysler and General Motors would have entered into bankruptcy proceedings, arguably they would have reemerged as the true car companies of the 21st century, as opposed to arguably being pumped up and perpetuated in ways that ultimately I think we're going to see played out here in years to come. So government involvement, picking winners and losers. Here we go again. Stop the notion of picking winners and losers. Make it a fair environment, a fair competitive environment. These companies bankrupted themselves. They should have been allowed to reap the consequences of that and have gone into bankruptcy and again would have reemerged as the true car companies of the 21st century. I would argue we've got troubles for these companies down the road.
Thanks, John. This question goes out to next month. The space shuttle program is scheduled to retire after 30 years. And last year, President Obama effectively killed government-run spaceflight to the International Space Station and wants to turn it over to private companies. In the meantime, U.S. astronauts would ride Russian spacecraft at a cost of $50 to $63 million a seat. What role should the government play in future space exploration?
I don't want to trivialize this response, but long term, and by long term I mean over the course of millions and billions of years, the sun is going to get closer to the Earth, and at a point the Earth will not be inhabitable. So the long-term survival of the human race depends on us being able to go to other planets, to actually inhabit other planets. So in that context, but given the budgetary consequence, I'm believing that government needs to be cut by 43% because that's the amount of money that we're borrowing and printing for every dollar that we're spending. In that context, the space program at this point needs to be reduced by 43%.
Thanks very much, John. I'd like to go back to you. Let's talk about housing. Roughly right now, there are about a million homes in the hands of banks and lenders. Millions of more homeowners are upside down, meaning they owe more than their home is worth. What would you or your administration do to try to right the housing ship?
Well, we should have never bailed out. The mortgage bankers. I think that what we lacked in this whole equation was a real fire sale. I think that if there would not have been bailouts, that the mortgage crisis would have been perhaps steeper, but it would have been a steeper decline and it would have been a steeper recovery. And I'm suggesting that there really has been no recovery whatsoever because we've never really had a fire sale. The government needs to get out of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, get out of that business completely, recapitalize those entities in the private sector, and get government out of guaranteeing mortgage-backed securities.
You see the E. coli scare that's going on in Europe right now. You're trying to cut money. The FDA, other agencies are getting involved in that or in front of you. What do you do?
Look, things happen in this world, and when it comes to food safety, we're going to have incidents of food safety. We're going to have incidents where people get sick or die from food in the system. That the FDA, that we spend millions and millions of dollars on the FDA, the notion that they're going to prevent these kinds of things from happening across the board, I think that's government, and that's the fear that we have, that if we don't spend money on these issues, that we're going to have these issues, and the reality is that we do have these issues. Government should be setting standards. Government should be providing an oversight or an enforcement for those companies that would be bad actors in this environment. But so much of what happens isn't bad acting, it's genuinely accidents that do occur. So the notion of adding more money to the FDA is not going to do away with these problems in the future. And as governor of New Mexico, I was willing to stand up and say, look, it's laudable that we should want to address X, Y, or Z issue, but spending this money really isn't going to make a difference in any of our lives other than to provide money for those contractors or providers that are going to actually benefit from being able to provide the oversight without any real benefit to any of us.
You've been a chief executive of state. I was just in Joplin, Missouri. I've been in Mississippi and Louisiana and Tennessee and other communities dealing with whether it's the tornadoes, the flooding, and worse. FEMA's about to run out of money, and there are some people who say do it on a case-by-case basis, and some people who say, you know, maybe we're learning a lesson here that the states should take on more of this role. How do you deal with something like that?
Government should be divesting themselves of, federal government should be divesting themselves of this issue to the states, because the states can better set the tone for where we should be developing and where we shouldn't be. And I know that the federal government, because of their guarantees of insurance to individuals that would build in floodplains or in areas that are subject to natural disasters, is just downright wrong. And if the federal government wouldn't have gotten involved in guaranteeing these insurance programs, we would not have the catastrophes. Not that we wouldn't have real problems and issues, but they wouldn't be nearly as bad, because no insurance company, in often cases, insurance companies would not step in to provide the insurance that the federal government has.
Dancing with the Stars or American Idol?
American Idol.
BlackBerry or iPhone?
I have a BlackBerry. It works fine, but I have an iPad, and it really works terrifically. So I'm afraid might be an iPhone in the future. BlackBerry for now, okay.
Thanks very much, John. And I have Dr. Paul Collins, who you've been running a family practice in Manchester for how long?
27 years.
Nice work. So not surprising your question is related to health care. What's your question, sir?
Yes, sir. As a member of the baby boomer generation, I've been contributing to Medicare through payroll taxes for over 30 years. How do you propose to keep Medicare financially solvent for the next 50 years and beyond?
I propose divesting the federal government of Medicare. Give Medicare back to the states with a significant reduction in what we spend on Medicare, because Medicare is going to engulf the entire federal budget here in a fairly short amount of time if it's not brought under control. So federal government divest itself of Medicare to the states. 50 laboratories of innovation, 50 laboratories of best practices. You know what? We would see best practices for the delivery of health care to those over 65. There would be terrific best practices that would get emulated by other states because we're all very competitive. There would be terrible failure that would get avoided by states because we're all looking at, we would all be looking at failure and success. But the notion that Washington one size fits all, that has us in the problem that we're in right now. And that problem that we're in right now is that we are on the verge of a financial collapse because there's no repaying $14 trillion in debt given a $1.65 trillion deficit this year, last year, the year before, and years going forward. We need to balance the budget. We need to balance the budget now. As President of the United States, I would propose a balanced budget for the year 2013, and in that balanced budget would be reductions in Medicare that would be divesting the federal government of Medicare to the states.
Thank you, John. Back to you, and while you're kind of fired up there, let's turn to Social Security. Could you be specific regarding ages, income levels? Everyone talks about reform. What is your specific Social Security reform plan in regard to raising the retirement age, at what ages, cutting benefits, and at what income level means testing kicking in?
So there are a number of suggestions when it comes to fixing Social Security. And by the way, Social Security it's not about cutting Social Security. And Social Security is a relatively small problem relative to Medicare. Medicare is going to engulf the entire federal budget in a very short amount of time if it's not brought under control. But raising the retirement age, 72, means testing. Means testing, I think, is so broad that it would be wrong to talk about means testing, but the notion that you pay in a certain amount of money, and that if you're making a certain amount of money, that you shouldn't perhaps get more out of Social Security than what you pay in. That would kind of be fundamental to means testing. And then lastly, you could change the escalator that's built into Social Security from the wage index to the inflation rate, which in and of itself, I understand, would make Social Security solvent way into the future.
The Treasury Department says the United States will hit its credit limit on August the 2nd. Do you believe we will ultimately have to raise the debt ceiling?
I think that politicians are going to raise the debt ceiling. I would hope they would not. And by not raising the debt ceiling, we're going to have a huge issue by not raising the debt ceiling. The huge issue is that we would actually have to live within our means. I would argue that we should do that now, that as big a problem as this is going to be, and it's going to be huge, it's going to be pale in comparison to what's down the road, and what's down the road is a financial collapse. Look, nobody's going to loan us money if they don't think they're going to get repaid, and that's really the crux here. There aren't as many individuals or countries loaning us money, and so we're having to print this money. And the financial crisis is a literal breakdown in our currency. It's a complete devaluation of our dollar that's in the works unless we actually balance the federal budget.
Thank you, John. And I'm joined by Jared Kinney, who runs a juvenile arrest unit out of Massachusetts. And I'm told that that has nothing to do with your question.
Correct. I was wondering what your definition of the separation of church and state is and how it will affect your decision making.
Well, I think it's an obvious question and that it has an obvious answer. There should be a separation of church and state, and as governor of New Mexico, I would like to think that that was in fact what happened in the state of New Mexico, and that would be my presidency.
Deep dish or thin crust?
I have celiac disease. I am gluten intolerant, so I'm afraid pizza, for the most part, is out for me. But the pizza that I can enjoy, which would be gluten-free crust, would be thin crust.
Spicy or mild?
Mild.
New Hampshire is one of 5 states where individuals who happen to be gay can marry legally. This is a question of conflicting interests. I know you're opposed to same-sex marriage. As president, would you try to overturn, what influence would you use from the White House to try to overturn these state laws?
I believe that this is a state's issue, so no, I would not in any way try and overturn any state's decision, regardless of the issue. But in this case, I think that the government should get out of the marriage business completely. That when it comes to civil unions, that the government should endorse civil union between heterosexual or homosexual couple. That should be something that government would endorse. Leave marriage to the churches.
All right, let me ask you another question. The Obama administration is in the process, and Leon Panetta, as the new defense secretary, will implement essentially the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So gays will be allowed to serve openly in the military. I want to ask each of you, and again, if we can be quickly, because then we want to get to the voters' questions. If you become president of the United States, now gays are allowed to serve openly in the military. Would you leave that policy in place, or would you try to change it? Go back to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or something else?
I have always supported the notion of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so that should remain in place. The fact that gay servicemen and women would serve in this country and give of their lives or put their lives on the line and not be able to express their sexual preference, to me, is not right.
Governor Romney used to support abortion rights until he changed his position on this a few years ago. This has been thoroughly discussed. But do you believe he genuinely changed his mind, or was that a political calculation? Should this be an issue in this primary campaign?
It should not be an issue in the primary. If he has changed his mind, then he's changed his mind.
And I have a question for you. Governor Paul Lentia says he opposes abortion rights except in cases of rape, incest, or when the mother's life is at stake. Do you have any problem with that position? And if so, why?
Well, I support a woman's right to choose. Up until viability of the fetus, as governor of New Mexico, I would have signed a bill banning late-term abortion. I've always favored parental notification. I've always favored counseling. I've always favored the notion of not using public funds when it comes to abortion because so many are opposed to that.
Yes, thanks, John. I'm here with Lydia Cumby. She lives in Franconia, and she is a naturalized citizen who moved to New Hampshire several years ago from Minnesota, of all places. And she's got a question about immigration.
As a naturalized American citizen who came here legally, I would like to know how you, as a president, plan to prevent illegal immigrants from using our health care, educational, or welfare systems.
Well, first of all, I don't think that illegal immigration should be about welfare at all. It should be about work. And how are you going to implement that? You're going to have the states determine best how to actually enforce the notion of no welfare when it comes to illegal immigration. But make those choices. And I'm not saying that legal immigrants shouldn't be entitled to benefit, but I think that that would be coupled with actually paying in to our system. So we have a welfare state in this country. We have to address the welfare state that we have in this country. Are illegal immigrants coming into this country, illegal immigrants coming into this country and taking entry-level jobs from Americans? Absolutely not, because we as Americans can sit at home and collect a welfare check that's just a little bit less money or the same amount of money for doing nothing. I would also say that immigration is a good thing. This is a country based on immigration. I think because of our convoluted immigration policies, we're educating the best and brightest kids from all over the world, and because of our convoluted immigration policies, we're sending them back to their countries of origin, as opposed to them staying here and ultimately starting up their businesses that would employ tens of millions of Americans, as opposed to tens of millions of Indians, which is what we've set up. Back to abolishing the federal corporate income tax, establish this country as the only place to start up, grow, and nurture business.
The question comes up, though, once they're in the country illegally, you have compassion sometimes bumps up against enforcing the law and state budget crises. A 5-year-old child of an illegal immigrant walks into an emergency room. Does the child get care?
So I think that this is a state's issue by state. As governor of New Mexico, I would like to have compassion and would want to provide a way to provide that treatment for that 5-year-old. Would I make that happen if I were governor of New Mexico? Yes, I think that I would, and that I would support making the fact that that would happen. Should the federal government dictate that? No way, because states may have differing opinions on this, and that's states' rights, and the best way to deal with these problems exists at the states.
And another issue that's come up in recent years as this debate has bubbled up is the whole question of birthright citizenship. If there are 2 illegal immigrants, 2 adults who came into this country illegally, and they have a child, should that child be considered a citizen of the United States?
I think that the 14th Amendment should get revisited. I don't think it was ever meant to address 2 illegal immigrants in this country having a child. But that is something I think that is left best to a debate on comprehensive immigration reform that I would like to see happen in this country much sooner than later. I'd like to see this happen immediately.
There are an estimated maybe 20 million illegal immigrants in this country. People have different numbers. If you were going to round them all up, Congressman Tom Tancredo on this stage 4 years ago would have said, round them up and kick them out. They broke the law. They shouldn't be here.
No, I would not. I think there needs to be recognition of the number one reason why we have 11 million illegal immigrants in this country. And that number one reason is that when Reagan set up his amnesty period in the 80s, He coupled it with putting government in charge of quotas for businesses that needed workers, for workers that wanted to come into this country. And because government was in charge of that, that was a breakdown from day one. I think the government should make it as easy as possible for someone that wants to get a work visa and be in this country. A work visa, in my opinion, should entail a background check and a Social Security card that applicable taxes would get paid. With regard to the 11 million illegal immigrants that are here in this country, I think we should set up a grace period. We can give them a legal work visa, background check, Social Security card, and then once we make laws that are easy to conform with, then we should enforce these laws. So make it that's securing the borders. So make it a one strike, you're out. If we've made it easy to be documented in this country to work, if you're in this country working illegally, you'll be arrested, you'll be deported, and you won't come back and work in this country again. One strike, you're out.
Here in New Hampshire, there is a popular bill that is being considered by our state legislature that would restrict the state's power to seize private land to build a power plant or a transmission facility. Should governments at any level be able to use eminent domain for major projects that will reduce America's dependence on foreign oil?
I'm in the camp that government should not be using eminent domain ever. I am trying to think of any example as governor of New Mexico where I would have implemented or used eminent domain for any project anywhere, and I can't think of it.
The Senate tomorrow is going to be voting on possibly abolishing the ethanol tax effective July 1st, which ought to have a major impact on our friends in another early voting state in Iowa. They grow corn. This is a move that would basically remove tax credits worth $6 billion. Question to you is, do you support abolishing?
I support abolishing ethanol tax subsidies. To my knowledge, it takes more energy to produce ethanol than what it produces. And if that's not the case, then it ought to be able to stand on its own 2 feet in a free market system for energy.
Coke or Pepsi?
Water.
I'm here with John Brown from Swansea, New Hampshire. He's retired from the U.S. Navy, 25 years of service, and right now he has 3 sons serving in the Navy, so you can imagine he has a very important question. What would you like to ask tonight, John?
Osama bin Laden is dead. We've been in Afghanistan for 10 years. Isn't it time to bring our combat troops home from Afghanistan?
It was time to bring our combat troops home from Afghanistan 10 years ago. First of all, I think that our military action in Afghanistan was initially totally warranted. We were attacked. We attacked back. We are at war with terror, and we should remain vigilant to the war on terror. But after having been in Afghanistan for 6 months, we had effectively wiped out Al-Qaeda. Here we are in Afghanistan 10 years later, and we're also in Iraq building roads, schools, bridges, highways, and hospitals, and we're borrowing and printing money to the tune of 43 cents on every dollar. Let's get out of Iraq and Afghanistan tomorrow.
Let's focus on one. He said no bombing in Yemen. The strikes in Yemen have been targeted at al-Qaeda leaders, al-Qaeda operatives, who the President of the United States, who happens to be a Democrat in this case, views as serious threats against this nation. Do you agree with Congressman Paul there, or do you agree with President Obama and the strikes?
You know, when it comes to Yemen, I am really not privy on what the military threat was from Yemen. So I don't want to speak. I don't want to speak out of context on this. I don't want to speak in a way that suggests that I would not be vigilant to a military threat. But as I sit here, I don't know of what that military threat could have been or what it ostensibly was for us to be bombing Yemen.
Should the president have supported, joined initially more U.S. presence, but now a NATO operation? Was that the right thing to do? Is that in the vital national interest of the United States of America?
I think the United States should be vigilant against any military threat. I don't see that military threat at all in Libya. I am opposed to Libya A through Z. Where was the congressional authorization to go into Libya? Where is it in our Constitution that says that because we don't like a foreign dictator, that we should go in and topple that foreign dictator? Aren't there 5 other countries in the Middle East right now that qualify for the same military intervention that we have implemented in Libya? I just don't see an end to this kind of foreign policy. Are we not creating more enemies in the world than friends?
Yeah, staying on this topic, John, thank you. I'd like you to meet Greg Saltz, who lives in here, Manchester, New Hampshire. What's your question tonight for the candidates?
I support the U.S. military, but frankly, we are in debt up to our eyeballs. We have nation building going on around the world where the world's police force, World War II is over, the Korean War is over, but we still have military bases all over Europe, all over Asia. We have something like 900 military bases all around the world. And I want to know if there's a candidate on the stage who's willing to shut down the bulk, not the bulk of these bases, but the bases that aren't vital to our national security, and take that money to pay off our national debt.
I know of no one in this country that thinks that we should have 100,000 troops on the ground in Europe. I haven't talked to anybody who believes that we should have 30,000 troops in Japan, and the prior Prime Minister ran a campaign on getting the United States out of Japan, and not from a negative standpoint, but from the standpoint that we, Japan, can take care of this. You don't have to do this any longer. And yet we still remained in Japan, over which he ended up resigning. South Korea. I think that we need to be looking at reducing our involvement all across the globe, and I am talking about reducing military defense spending by 43%. And I'm looking to supplement that with other countries taking up the slack, something that they haven't done for decades, because we've supplemented all of that spending.
Public opinion polls consistently result in low approval ratings for Congress as a whole, and early polls show a lack of enthusiasm for this field of candidates. Most of you will say that you don't watch polls, but shouldn't you pay attention to public sentiment? And aren't these polls a direct reflection of what voters are and are not looking for?
I think that that's the most important poll that's out there right now, that there is and I would argue that it's not just Republicans, that it's politics in general, and that it's very justified. We've all elected the problems that we have in this country, one congressperson, one senator, and one president at a time, and if we're going to continue with the status quo, I don't know why we think we're going to change things. We need to really shake it up. I'm offering myself up as the shake-up when it comes to the President of the United States. And I would also offer up my resume that would suggest that what I'm talking about here, I will go after completely with all my energy and effort, and that is part of my resume.
Look back on 2008 and the process. President Obama made a pick. Senator McCain made a pick. Who made the best choice?
Well, the election was won by Barack Obama and Senator Biden, and I'm under the belief that people vote for the top candidate and not the vice presidential candidate. So with regard to who made the best pick, one candidate won, one ticket won, the other ticket didn't. I guess the better choice, according to the American electorate, was Biden and Obama.
If you were the President of the United States and you could pick one, but just one of these gentlemen and the lady to join your administration, who would it be and why?
Well, it would be Ron Paul.
What have you learned in the last 2 hours?
I've learned that being excluded from these debates has been excruciatingly demoralizing. And I never thought that I would be excluded from these debates. I'm a believer in the system, and to me the system is a cracked door. What you make out of that cracked door is up to your own gumption and your own energy, but here it is, the door was shut for me, and not only was it shut, but it was locked. And so what I've learned is that this is very, very frustrating, and I never thought that I would be subject to answering these questions offset as opposed to being there at the debate table.